everybody. We're here to discuss the American dream and how it might be fractured and how we've represented in our novels and other novels we've read. So we're each going to kind of give our own bio, since there's not anyone really introducing us today, and talk a little bit about our own novels, and then we're going to kind of open it up to discuss some of the ideas of the American dream that we're each trying to interrogate in our books and in other books. So I'm Susan Bernhard. I'm the author of Winter Loon, and I live in Boston now, but I was born and raised in the Bitterroot Valley down in Hamilton. And I started writing this novel in 2012 and did most of my work through a writing center in Boston called Grub Street. And the book came out in December of 2018. And that's about it for me. That's enough for me.
Rebecca. Just my bio, not
just your bio, and then we'll go to the next part.
I'm Rebecca. I live in Portland, Oregon. I've been an investigative journalist for the last 20 years. Mostly I started my career at High Country News in Western Colorado. So that was really my graduate school. And I learned all about the West through that writing and writing about book policy and so many Westerners that I just think often don't make the front page of most papers. But High Country News, that's, as many of you may know, that's what they do. It's a paper for people who care about the West. And then I moved to Portland, Oregon, where I live now with my family, maybe like 16 years ago, a long time ago at this point. But I've continued to spend my time writing for magazines about the rural West, except for when I took a left turn when I was pregnant with my first child and decided to write a novel. And that novel is Kicked Down. And Kicked Down is set in rural Colorado. It's the story of two sisters whose father has died, and they have returned home to try and save their family's ranch. And the night that a natural gas well explodes or has a kick down, it's a real thing that happens, their lives are kind of irrevocably changed. And they intersect with an Iraq war vet who's recently returned home, who also has a pretty hard time that night. It's a very dramatic moment in the book. And their lives intertwine, and the story goes on, and I'll say more about that later. But I'm back to writing nonfiction mostly, and working on a new book project at this point. But that is nonfiction, but I really love writing fiction, and yeah, it's great.
You write another novel someday.
I want to, I have one, yeah.
James is talking, so...
Am I next? Okay, so first of all, just want to say thank you to Sam, Tess, I don't know if they're here, all of the volunteers, all of the venue organizers, all of the donors, everybody who helped make this festival happen, because it's been really fantastic. This is actually my first time in Montana. Thank you. I came out a week early, or a few days early, and did some hiking up around Glacier National Park. Came down here and have sort of absolutely fell in love with Missoula in like the 3 days that I've been here. So you have not seen the last of me in Montana. And also, I should mention, I have a thankfully unused canister of bear spray that I can't take back on the plane with me. So if anybody has any use for that, hit me up. I'm happy to give that to you. So real quickly, my name's James Charlesworth. This is my debut novel. It's called The Patricide of George Benjamin Hill. And I'll talk a little bit about the book. I think we're going to go around and actually talk about the books. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I moved up to Boston for grad school, and I've kind of been in the New England area ever since, most of that time in Boston, but also a few years in Maine that I spent sort of finding myself as a writer. So now I'm back in Boston, worked on this novel for 7 or 8 years, had a few previous novels that sort of fell apart in my hands, so it was a long journey to get to the point where this book is out in the world, and it's been super exciting. It came out in January, so I'm excited to talk about it with you all.
Erin, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. My name is Erin Pringle. I grew up in the rural Midwest in a town of 3,000, and in the same, grew up there the whole time. Then I moved to Texas near Austin to go to grad school, and then lived there for about a decade, and now I've been in Spokane, Washington for about a decade. And the book that is about to come out is a novel called Hezada, I Miss You, and that's going to come out in 2020. And the book here that's available is The Whole World at Once, which is a collection of short stories. And then my first book was a collection of short stories, The Floating Order. And all of my work revolves in some way around grief. A lot of people around me have died, whom I love, and a lot of people around me. When you grow up in a rural town, you know everyone, and everyone's dying because it's a rural town, so everyone tends to be in the aging range. And anyone who's young tries to get out, and most don't succeed. For a number of reasons. And so when I saw the title of this panel, I hadn't been assigned to it. I thought, I need to go be on that panel because I'm going to have too many comments in the audience. I'll be so rude. So I should just ask if I can be on. Right? Because it's all I read about. It's all I basically think about. And I think grief and death is such an American dream. There's so many narrative arcs of once you die, then you'll reach this wonderful place that we have that kind of death narrative. And so even in the grieving journey, it feels like such a no, like that's not, the American dream's not working in any way. And so I need to tell you that. And I'm just going to keep writing that book and story in every way. So that's me, Erin Pringle.
All right.
And Emily.
And my name is Emily Strelo, and my book is called The Wild Birds. And I've been a biological field tech for about 12 years. Mostly birds, but lots of herps and snakes and other fun things. And often my agent, who when he edits my manuscripts, will say, "Don't forget the people, Emily." You'll find a lot of animals and landscape and biology in this book. And as that relates to, I'll talk about how that relates to my unusual version or interpretation of the American dream later. But I have two lovely boys, and I live in Portland, Oregon. Now I was born and raised in the valley there. And I've just moved back about 5 days ago from the Midwest. So yes, we'll talk more about the American dream and what that does or doesn't mean.
So I think to kind of get us started, each of us is going to talk just a little bit, rather than do a reading today, we're going to kind of talk about the bigger pictures in our novels and how it relates to the American dream. And I think that we should start with the biggest of the big pictures. So I'm going to have James start first. Yeah, because his novel is, I think, unlike what the rest of us are doing, James actually wrote a great American novel.
Oh.
No, well, it's been like in that
So much
in
pressure.
kind of that language of the great American novel. So it stretches literally from coast to coast, and there's a fulcrum that's pulling you into the middle. So it really is. It is about America.
Yeah.
And it has some of the Western mythology as
Right,
well.
so this is kind of the perfect panel for me because my novel, for better or worse, sort of like tackles the issue of the American dream in a very overt way. So like I said, it's called The Patricide of George Benjamin Hill, and that's sort of a title that intentionally begins to tell the story of the book. So while I was working on it, over like the 7 or 8 years that I was working on it, I would have this little sentence when people asked me what my novel was about that I would sort of pull out of my back pocket and just sort of cast at them like dice. And that sentence was that the book is about 4 adult siblings who decide to kill their father. And then I would sort of judge based on their expression whether it landed as like double sixes or like snake eyes and sort of either back away. But I would usually begin by sort of reassuring people that it's not as dark as it sounds. It's really about, maybe that's true, maybe that's not true, but it's really about the lives of these 4 siblings and growing up in a household with this father who has been consumed by this relentless pursuit of what he considers the American dream. And for him, it's very tied to wealth. And so there are two main storylines in the novel that sort of begin parallel and then sort of converge over the course of the book. And the first storyline begins with this character, George Benjamin Hill, who is this eponymous patriarch who's potentially being patricided. It sort of begins, you like that as my new verb. Yeah. So it begins, he's born in Oklahoma, grows up on a farm, the Great Depression comes, his family migrates to California, he is orphaned at a young age, and he sort of bounces around, and because he grew up in poverty, he has sort of attached the idea of happiness to financial wealth. And so his goal becomes to find a way that he can sort of achieve this dream that he has sort of created for himself. So he gets involved in the fast food industry in California. He has a family, he has 2 children, sort of quickly screws that up. Has a second wife and 2 children with her. The fast food thing sort of runs its course, so he then drags his family up to Alaska, Fairbanks, Alaska, which at the time was kind of this boom town. It's during the 70s when they found oil in Alaska and they began building the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And so throughout this portion of the narrative, you sort of see this through the perspectives of the children. It's in third person, so it's he, she, but you get it from their perspectives. And these children are eventually sort of escape him by sort of flinging themselves off and becoming estranged in this effort to kind of find themselves and escape this life that their father has sort of brought them to. And then the second parallel narrative is when these kids are grown up, they're all between the ages of 40 and 50, and they have all sort of found themselves in these sort of sordid, failed places in their lives in the 4 corners of the country. One of them is a failed ex-minor league baseball player in Miami. One is sort of suffering from mental health issues, living in a halfway house in Manhattan. One is an ex-showgirl sort of struggling with addiction recovery in Las Vegas. And then another is sort of a hermit bush pilot in Alaska. He's still in Alaska. And they sort of find themselves, for a variety of reasons, sort of converging on their father, who is now semi-retired, sort of embroiled in scandal in Omaha. So they're converging sort of on the center of the country. So that's sort of like this weird structural thing that I came up with to tell this sort of big story. There are a lot of personal and weird reasons why I did that, but that's sort of how my book. Yeah. And then hopefully, if you can make it through this 100,000 words of like misery and torture, at the end there's hopefully sort of an idea of a glimmer of hope for what might be next. So.
Emily, I think maybe you should go next because Emily has written a novel that is part historical fiction, and I think giving us that glimpse into the past would be kind of the next obvious step.
Okay, yeah. So it's similar to James's book. There are many different narratives coming together, and it spans about 120 years. But the difference between maybe James and mine is that none of these people are living within any sort of normal social structure. So all the characters are living outside of the confines of what society expects of them. But the narratives are all interconnected. So it's kind of almost like tracing paper. Each layer has a few lines of the picture, and then the next story comes over, and you get, ideally, by the end of the book, if you are a reader who loves puzzles, you're putting together the puzzle pieces, and you're putting together the tracing paper, and a final sort of image emerges. And that image is an alternative to this idea of the American dream. They're all searchers, they're weirdos, they're freaks, right? So they're all out there looking for something that is not money. Some of them have left money. There's a character who is called the Wanderer, and he leaves Seattle and his moneyed parents in order to wander in looking for meaning in nature, right? And he befriends no spoilers, but he befriends an abandoned fighting cock, and they form a friendship. And I mean,
Don't forget the people, Emily.
so don't forget the people, right? What about another fighting cock? But the main story is a woman and her daughter living in Oregon in the Willamette Valley, and they're bound by some dark secrets, and they are having a hard time being friendly with each other. And in a sense, it's like they're the story that roots the whole book, but all these stories from the past. There's a girl rather, who poses as a boy and lives to be a lighthouse keeper's assistant on the Farallon Islands, and she is pretending to be a boy in the 1870s in order to be employed as an orphan, right? Because the other options for female orphans were not something that she was interested in San Francisco. So, but the mother and daughter are rooting these other stories. They're all wandering. They're all looking for a place to be, but none of them own land. And I think that's really important, except for the mother and daughter, who have inherited this house and this filbert orchard, which is kind of like the burden for them to bear, the albatross around their neck. So the American dream in that sense is sort of cracked open. It's disintegrated into just a pile of shell at some point in the book, and then the reader has to put those pieces back together to kind of see an alternative for living life and having hope.
Yeah, if you guys can pass your notes on the American Dream to the outside, we'll. No, you're fine. We'll just move forward. And,
We're kind of running this by.
I'm gonna get an assistant. Joni, or yeah, if you don't mind, yeah. No, Joni, you don't need to. Someone else is already standing. So Becca, why don't you go next and talk a little bit about the American Dream and Kick Down? I think it's really interesting because part of what James, these big issues of wealth and energy and the consumption of resources, I think Becca's novel is more in that contemporary space.
Yeah.
Well, I came to this novel, as I said, I was a reporter for a really long time, and I've said this several times on stage before, so forgive me if you've heard this, but I love reporting. I really think it's more important than ever before, and yet I have gotten frustrated with the limitations that you encounter as a magazine reporter. There's always a deadline, there's always a word count. I never feel like I have enough time and space, and what often ends up getting cut from my magazine stories is how it feels, the feeling part of any story. And because my stories are often about small communities, people who are invisible, who are sort of butting up. Actually, my magazine stories over and over again have been about individuals really butting up against the American dream. And so I wanted to, for years, I've been at like dinner parties, and people are like, "What are you working on?" And I'm like, "A book." And that's what it's about. I'm like, "It's about feeling." You know, it's like, okay, what's the other person around me doing? But so that's what led me to want to write this novel, and to get at how does it feel in this moment in the contemporary West to live in a small community when land is so important to us as Westerners. and the very, very hard choices that people and families are often forced to make to choose how to sustain their land. And I think where I'm coming up against that idea of the American dream in the West, what is that idea? It is rugged individualism. That's what we, I think, as Westerners think of ourselves at. That myth has been created by so many books that are beloved to us. How many people grew up reading Little House on the Prairie? How many people have read Prairie Fires, the new amazing biography by Carolyn Fraser? It's incredible. I can't recommend it enough. It tells, it's not only an autobiography of Laura Ingalls Wilder, it really unseals this veil of the myth of, she didn't, well, so much of those stories were not true. She left so much out. This idea, my own great-grandparents were homesteaders on the South Dakota Prairie, and they thought they were coming to an area that was uninhabited. Of course it wasn't uninhabited. The federal government had displaced thousands of indigenous Americans to make room for them to get this free land. And so my book, I recently did a podcast, and so the wonderful host said, it's a subversive Western, but you know, and I love that because she said, you're writing the stories of women, first of all, in that rugged individualistic narrative. So much of our stories about the West are about men. What is it? It's the lone cowboy on the prairie in silhouette, right? Mm-hmm. And so my book intentionally opens in a scene with Jackie, one of the sisters, and it's snowing. She's trying to inoculate a new calf. She is not doing a very good job, and she's got her dazzle gloves on, and they're slipping off, and she says to herself, and to the cow, surprise is always worse than pain. And I think for that idea of rugged individualism, that's true. If you can be in control, if you can manage your fear, you can get through anything, because we're stoic Westerners. And the last word of my book, I'm not going to give too much spoiler here, but the last word of my book is together. I think the actual sentence, I don't know, is anyone going to want to read my book if I tell you the last sentence?
If it's one word, I think we're good.
Well, the sun settles on their backs, and they move slowly into the hills, facing the long day ahead together. And I wanted to really write a different Western that says we have to come together to really find ourselves and save our land. And I really see in the course of my reporting that the communities, I have a kind of embarrassing TED Talk that you can find on the internet if you're curious about hearing me talk about this more, but you know that there are sort of typical ways that communities under pressure respond to those pressures, and I told my book from 3 different perspectives because I wanted each of them to embody that typical response to pressure in a small town. And I really feel like there's a 4th way, and that 4th way is thinking outside the box and coming up with new solutions that no one's done before, but you have to do those together as a community. So I think I've said enough now.
I actually saved the 2 of us for last because, so Erin said that she joined the panel kind of late. And so I'm not as familiar with your work.
No one is.
But yeah, now you're here. And I have a feeling that you and I are writing about kind of common themes. I'm talking about the small stuff, how the small stuff breaks you. And I think that might be what you're working with as well. So why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. So growing up, I think, I don't know, it's not, I don't think I had an unusual upbringing because I was brought to life in the 80s, but my parents were born in the 30s. And so I was a late in life child for them. And so I was, and at the same time, and my sister had been born at the typical generational time in the 60s for them, right? And so I was kind of witnessing their lives not panning out in the way that they had expected that they would. And so, and I came 16 years after my nearest sibling. So, and the town as well. It was the 80s, and this was when, and I didn't realize this, of course, because I was growing up there, and you just take everything as reality, as that's just how it is. But in hindsight, that's when corporate farming had really started to decimate my area. And so all the family farms that had once been self-sustaining and had brought and maintained those communities for a century, because originally, like the oil boom, that's basically the origin story that the white people who live in this small town that I grew up in use as this was when it was good, was when the oil was here, the town was founded, and there were train tracks where they aren't anymore. And so that was the best time. And then I came in the 80s, and there were maybe 4 families who still owned land, and they owned a lot of it. And I think it was a lot of corporations owned a lot of it, and they were still kind of maintaining it, and it's still true today. And so there were really only 3 names that you know, right? The Hanselmans, the Kokenauers, those are the main names, 2 names. And so witnessing, it was like, I don't know if this is perpetual. I mean, maybe every time someone's born, they're witnessing the last of what never was. And yet the myth is, these were good times, and we're going to bring them back, you know, in whatever way. And so this particular novel that I've written, when I was growing up, I remember watching David Copperfield on TV and really wishing that magic existed. And I remember he had some card trick where you touched the screen and then you kept moving your hand to the card and then he revealed it. And I so wished that it existed. And so I think a lot of my stories begin within me with that wish. And I want to write about these grand, wonderful times. And then, but then I get to the point where it's like, oh, well, fuck, they're not going to be, they'll be resolved in a really pretty way that I don't believe in and that I didn't grow up in. And no one I grew up in had, and yet we all told the story as though we did. So I can't do that. And so I think for a while, the novel, like I knew it was going to be set in the circus. And I think maybe my inclination was do it in the grand times, you know, because a lot of circus narratives they go back in time and the present story is 1860 or 1910 when the circus is at its very beginnings in its capitalistic sort of move of pretending that tragedy is not why they're making money from going from town to town to town. And that on that day, everyone's so happy because they can pretend that their lives are possible, like the circus is possible for their own. So anyway, what's my point? My point is, I'm asking myself, and maybe you know. So, so my novel is set in the present day, which often, because it's rural, feels like the 1940s because it's so maintained. You know, you walk into any small town and the same families are there, the descendants of those families, the houses, the schools, the school teachers are the children of the former school teachers, and you can't escape the narratives of, anyway. So the circus, and when I was a little girl, my sister, who killed herself 10 years ago, and she had been born in the 60s, so she took me to the circus. She was 16 years older, so she must have been in her mid-20s. So it was like I watched her American dream start while my parents were ending. You know, like there was no hope left for them. In reality, right? Like, in reality. And so, but I remember the circus came once to my town. And it is set up by the public pool in the park. And my sister took me to it. And I remember it being just awful. You know, like it was not beautiful. There was another circus that came to Terre Haute, which was bigger and had, you know, like the stadium. You would go into Holman Center and it would be black and there would be these beautiful lights. It would be very David Copperfield, right? And And so my story, my novel takes place in the in a small town, and it's not doing well, and the storefronts are no longer there. They're all empty. The circus is coming. Sorry, I'm just like a gravitational pull towards you. Yeah, I know, I'm a marble. I'm a marble, and you're at the bottom of my hill, man. The novel. Yeah, so the village is falling apart, as it has been for 40 years. And they're still wishing, like, maybe it's going to get better. They have plans. They have lampposts, 4 of them. But then they gave up on that because it was ridiculous. Like, it didn't work out because it doesn't. And then the circus has been coming every year for 100 years. And it's, down to 4 performers, a couple acrobats. But everyone it's this sort of exploration of everyone remembering how it used to be, though no one was really there for it. And then it's the exploration of why people can't get out of these places. Because I know I'm an anomaly, right? I am the day on like any other day that happens because I got out, but none of my friends did, right? And so I wanted a story that showed that. Like, this is why we don't have, we have bootstraps, but they've strangled all of us, right? And so so it's an exploration of that situation, and it follows several people from the circus and several people from the town, and it's a Midwestern circus, so it's always going from Florida back to the Midwest and going around, and that's what it is. That's exploration. I'm sorry.
No, that's good.
Go for it.
So kind of in the same vein of what Erin was talking about. So Winterloon is set in a particular year in this boy's life. His name is Wes Ballot, and he's abandoned by his father after his mother drowns in a Minnesota lake. And he's a reminiscent narrator, so he's an adult around the age of 30 looking back at this particular year in his life. And so the story is definitely a small town story, and it's a family story. There's 4 families that were introduced to over the course of the book. And so there's Wes and his parents, and the book opens with the parents struggle. They're just an unhappy couple. They struggle with alcohol addiction. They struggle economically. His father, Moss, is kind of like a handyman, but he travels. Sometimes he's up on the pipeline in Alaska. Sometimes he works for a carnival. He's maybe a welder. And he kind of moves in and out of their lives, but they stay together, this couple, and raise this one child. They've lost a child earlier. And when Wes's mother dies, he goes to live with his mother's grandparents. And so Gip and Ruby are the grandparents, and they're living in a house that they used to own. They fell behind on their mortgage, and it was repossessed by the bank, and so now they're paying rent to the bank, and they've lost their sense of ownership. And so Wes is kind of living in the bitterness and despair that they experience just daily. And then he's introduced to another family, a Native American family, and that's a blended family who has taken in the matriarch in that family has taken in her sister's daughter, and her sister had committed suicide, and the daughter has witnessed a lot of the trauma that Native American women experience. I'm not Native American, but I was very interested in this story, and so I was really trying to bring this part of the Midwest, that narrative of how people, like I live in the East Coast, and a lot of people think that all people who are Native American live on reservations, for starters. Like, they have this notion still of a reservation society, and not an understanding of how these are families on or off the reservation trying to find now their place in a new American dream. I mean, this was not, they had another dream, and the white people came in and changed that for them. And so trying trying to find their way into this society that kind of wants to push them on the outside. And then the last family they actually live in Montana, and the story arc takes west from Minnesota to Montana. And it's a young woman living with her daughter and her mother. Her father's dead, and they were probably the most successful family in some ways, because they were, relatively intact, but kind of like what Erin is talking about. This young woman, Aveline, was in the small town and desperate to get out, desperate, like everything was closing in on her, and she meets a person who she thinks is going to be that vehicle out of town. And instead, it turns out he's not, because he never is. He really never is. I mean, the person that you think is going to be, your ticket out is never that person. And so she has to live with the repercussions of what her attempt to have the American dream. And so they're all like living this kind of day-to-day life, but struggling with the pressure of trying to do that thing that we talked about, which is, we want our kids to have a better life than we had, that kind of notion of the American dream. So, mine is very much a small town American story, I think. And I was really interested in looking and just shedding light on that small town story. So, those are our novels. And now we're going to talk, James is going to talk about...
Am I good? Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll go from there.
These were all amazing, by the way. They were so good. And I just I just picked a sampling, was what I decided to do. I wish I could read all of them, but it would just take too long, because we've yacked for so long.
But I'll take all of these, and I'll put together some kind of blog post or something for the book festival, and so when we figure that out, we'll share it with everybody. So come back to the book festival somehow or another, or get on your social media and I'll hashtag.
Yeah, there you go. Hashtag it.
Something about the American dream. Look for it. Yeah.
Like, the word that I latched onto was Rebecca's word, subversive, right? And so there are about 3 or 4 different types of these. There are some that sort of go the old school American dream, right? And then there are some that are sort of completely subverting that, right? They're sort of like, it's like the post-American dream society now, right? And so it's become like something that we sort of know so much about, or we've heard so much about, that we're like automatically rebel against it. And then there's some people who sort of present the original version and then kind of subvert it. So they do both things. So I'm just gonna read a few. I should have put these in like a better narrative order, but I just grabbed a few. So first one, work hard, get ahead, feel secure. Right?
Lies. No, I'm just kidding.
Enough, but that is it. Right? That's totally it.
Yeah.
That's totally what it is. Then we've got...
And it's about the freedom to do that.
Right, exactly.
It's about freedom.
So here's another one. Opposite. It's dead and gone. And as George Carlin says, it's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. Right? I think these are all awesome, by the way. Let me see. I think I'm going to do this one next. The American dream is home ownership, white picket fence, a job with benefits, 2.5 kids, and a new car. It's the belief that upward mobility is available to everyone equally if they just work hard enough. It's more of a myth than reality. 2 more. And these are all maybe kind of similar, I can't remember. What I've been taught, freedom to succeed no matter what your station or class or race, etc. What it means now, freedom to seek out success and independence by doing whatever you can to get it. Businesses don't care about consumers. Government doesn't care about people unless there's a profit. Right? One more. And this one, totally is my novel. I think this is the one, and that's why I picked it. But the person maybe they had heard me and then read. But an outdated post-World War II concept of American prosperity is no longer ecologically or economically possible. We need a more sustainable model! ! Especially for young people who feel defeated and failed in the face of trying to attain it. So those are kind of the 5 that I just thought were kind of the best launching off points for our discussion. Because I think in various ways, like each of our novels kind of address that. But I think all of our novels are kind of subversive, right?
It's weird to me that all of those, and maybe all of them, but they're all talking about success as a kind of wealth or acquiring something as the definition of success. And I think that's really interesting because the idea of the American dream was actually a kind of a spiritual and philosophical idea when it was first introduced, and it became this kind of advertising thing that you need to have a house and you need to have this wealth in order to be viewed as successful. And so as soon as you can't do that, if you're renting, you're a failure because you have failed to acquire property. But in reality, even when you buy a house, you're paying taxes to the city. You're paying, you're really renting it from the town. You pay way more. So I don't know. It's just really interesting. Sorry.
Right. So it began as a spiritual thing, and it's become like conformity. Like you're conforming to something instead of like seeking something beyond.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, it was originally about self-actualization.
Right.
Becoming your best self. Becoming your most capable person. And then the irony of it being co-opted by, mortgage companies and like when I came in here, I was
sorry. The mortgage company.
I did notice that just as I was saying it. However,
That's perfect. I'm so glad we're here.
I saw that when I came in. I was like, okay, we can address this and
Lots
talk
of
about it because
symbols,
it's in our notes already. So I mean, but it was sort of co-opted into advertising for something else, for consumerism, which is not all bad. We're not saying if you own a home, you're bad. We're just saying, like, looking at the history of the term, and I think the history of the term came to a stopping point probably, what decade do you think? Did it fall the 60s?
Late 60s, whenever.
Right, so we've had a long time to sort of re-examine that and start returning to the 70s and the 60s and the 70s. Definitely there was a return to the idea of self-actualization, right?
Part of the internet, or the housing market collapse was about, trying to achieve that dream of home ownership, to a fault.
Yeah.
And so now we have
Right.
properties all over the country.
To a fault, and then we've gone through that several times. Now in 2003, we revisited that fun place where we overextended. People overextended in order to achieve the dream. But with that in mind, I feel like all of our books, I mean, the ones that I've read these two beautiful books right here. I know they really address the way that the American dream can feel like a strangulation when you are living in poverty. And so I think that's what I kind of wanted to just get in there, is that in order to then break open the term, what do we do?
Well, don't you think that there's a question in fiction that people are trying to address now, that the American dream, when we talk about the American dream, we're kind of talking about a white people American dream.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that is an accurate vision for a lot of non-white people in this country. There's a novel called The Affairs of the Falcons that just came out this year. Melissa Rivero is the writer. And it's about a woman, an immigrant woman from Bolivia, I believe, and she is undocumented and living in New York, and there's this whole machine of people in New York who take advantage of the undocumented people in this country by giving them payday loans at a really high price and extracting all sorts of promises and making them do ungodly and wanton things to stay one step ahead of the immigration and naturalization services, and her American dream that fictional character's American dream was just to get here and this belief that somehow, who was saying, what you guys were saying, like, was it you that who in your family thought that the streets were actually?
Yeah, my great-grandfather truly believed that he'd get here and the streets would really be paved with gold. He really thought that. I want to make sure there's time for questions if we have them. And do we have till 12:15 or 12:30?
12:30, I think.
So I have one question sort of for us, and then maybe we'll turn it over to you guys. But I think, to me, we write books and we read books to have a better deepening sense. Both of our, like, I love reading novels when I see myself in the novel and I don't feel so alone in the world. And also when my sense of my world is expanded by learning about a place I don't spend much time in. And I love them for both of those reasons. And I think even though we're talking about a lot of darkness and like a lot of sort of trying to write, we've all tried to write these books that counteract this mythic idea of the American dream, and that's kind of depressing. I actually don't think our books are all super dark at all, and I wondered if everyone wanted to kind of quickly, if you have something to say about this, don't feel like you have to, like, I think I already kind of got at this personally. What are your books offering the reader, and maybe also yourself as the writer, as saying, you know, both a truth about the truth-telling, about the truth of the American dream, but also sort of what you see as the future for your characters that may be hopeful, that also expands that sense of reality, the myth of the American dream and the future of the American dream. Go.
One thing I've been thinking about, and I think it's connected to what you were just asking, is about ghost stories. And Linda Day, who is a pretty well-known folklorist, said that the function of telling ghost stories to each other is it always becomes a debate about belief. And so to tell those stories is to engage in a sort of societally acceptable way about belief and what one believes and afterlife and things like that. And so I was thinking about the American dream, because it's like we don't have that story to be like, here's the American dream story. I mean, we all know it, right? But we don't tell, you know, like I'm not going to tell my son, my American dream for you is that you'll have a better, you know. But we all know it, and our stories counter it. And so I was wondering, well, if we think about the American dream as a genre, then is to write about it or to counter it a debate about reality and what reality is. Is that how we then talk to each other? Because we can all agree it's BS, but we can't do it unless somebody starts the story. Otherwise, like at least in my small town, if you were to call BS on like this farming stuff, you would have just insulted the Kokenauers and the Hanselmans, and you didn't, like, you just ruined the next 5 generations of your family because they'll never forget what you did, right? And I'm only safe telling these stories because I'm no longer there. And if I was still there, I would still be straight because that's how I thought you got through. And because I had no idea that you know, like that you could be gay and live in a small town because you couldn't. And so I wonder, like, is it a debate about what reality is? And so storytellers are like, okay, so let's. Well, what do you think?
And our stories about the American dream always ghost stories, right? So like it's the American dream like a ghost that shows up.
And does it engender actually a sense of hope in all of us as readers to see stories that actually tell the truth, a more truthful story? Maybe that's
I think that was my ending place for my novel and stories, was that all of them, though they were functioning outside of the American dream, then they were all sort of living on very small amounts of money, and they were living in nature. So a lot of it is in observation of nature, finding place within a community, an ecological system that already exists. And that's, I think, a hopeful thing. Because if you find yourself in an ecological system that already exists, you appreciate it, you support it, you become part of it. And so the ultimate ending place for these characters, I mean, no spoilers, it's just, it's a place of hope, and it's a place of appreciation, and ultimately guardianship. So.
Yeah, and my book spends a lot of time sort of going over this decline and consequence of patriarchal society. And then one of the things I sort of tried to do consciously or unconsciously, I don't really remember, is toward the end of the book, the women sort of take the forefront in the book and sort of become the kind of the, there's a word I'm going to use, but it'll be a spoiler. They're the ones who are kind of left to carry on whatever is going to happen next in this story. So that was my way of kind of bringing an element of hope and kind of turning things around for hope for the future.
You said unconsciously, like what you did consciously and unconsciously, and even though my novel is written in the voice of a young man looking back on his life, it really became the story of the women in his life.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's that's very cool. And if there's a point of hope in the book, it's that it's the idea of breaking the cycle of generational trauma. And not carrying the burden. So like we talk about the American dream in this way where and it also becomes kind of a family thing. Like where's the single person in the American dream, right? So that's another conversation. But where we want more for our children and for this next generation, and that burden that we put on our children and those generations to carry our failures and become better people than we were. And so to break that cycle where you don't have to carry the failures of your parents into your future, you get to actually have your own agency and start your own life at the beginning without all that stuff in your past. So.
The point in your novel where someone says, Wes, I don't know if you know, but I'm proud of you. You've shouldered all of this and you've been a better person. I was like, tears, because that's true. It's like, it's true. It is. I mean, and that's, I think, where Springs home. So.
Do we want to do a question?
Questions?
Do we have time?
We have a few minutes.
Is there a session after this one?
Yeah.
Oh shoot. Okay. Who's got a question?
I just have a statement. I just finished reading The Road to Character by David Brooks, and that trying to put a value on intrinsic instead of extrinsic rewards. It's just something that we strive for, I think, but it's hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Would you recommend the book?
Yeah, I would. Yeah. Anybody else have questions? All right.
Well, thank you all so much. If anyone wants to buy a book from us, we're happy to sign them. They're taking your money in the back.